Pressing on with reading Transactionalism, Chapter 2. I'll be reading the first few pages of it, including the origin and early usage of transactionalism as viewed historically, Polybius and Galileo. Chapter 2, Transactionalism viewed historically. Origin and early usage. The term transaction is familiarly used in economics, by which discipline it has been defined as any exchange of goods between two parties, together with the accompanying negotiations. As employed by economists, it refers to the interdependence of buying and selling in the process of exchange. Transactional philosophers and psychologists have broadened its meaning without in the process losing the etymology. Examples of transactions are borrowing, lending, buying, selling, writing, reading, parent-child, and husband-wife. The paired names go together and are therefore correlative. Each member of a pair is an indispensable aspect of the complete transaction and cannot retain its status in the pair as a separate element or entity. Borrowing, for example, is an aspect of the borrowing-lending transaction, and cannot, without serious distortion, be regarded as an independent element. That is to say, one cannot borrow except with the help of a loan. The term is not strictly a modern creation, however. Polybius. Several years after the deaths of John Dewey and Arthur F. Bentley, the transactional psychologist Hadley Cantrill and his associates accidentally discovered in the writings of the Greek historian Polybius the term transaction, utilized in a manner remarkably similar to its usage by Dewey and Bentley. Polybius, who lived in the 2nd century BC, is believed by Toynbee to have made deliberate use of the word to characterize his own descriptions of the Roman conquest. He was intensely critical of his fellow historians, whose accounts of historical and contemporary events he found to be contradictory and oftentimes false. The theme of his criticism was that a full account of any event must embrace not only the existential event itself, but also its antecedents, for the actions of the past are put to the test by the actual course of events and therefore shed real light upon the aims and attitudes of individuals, revealing in some of them the existence of goodwill, good intentions, and practical helpfulness in our regard, and in others the opposite dispositions. Writers and readers of history ought to concentrate attention less upon the bald narrative of transactions than upon the antecedents, concomitants, and consequences of any given action. If you abstract from history the why and the how and the wherefore of the particular transactions and the rationality or the reverse of its results, what is left of her ceases to be a science and becomes a tour de force, which may give momentary pleasure but is of no assistance whatever for dealing with the future. Polybius castigated historians further for failing, even refusing, to concern themselves with the interrelation of events as these manifest themselves in their sequences, origins, and results. The consequences of these omissions for professional historicism, he said, are serious. The monographs of the historical specialists give no inkling of the whole picture, and if any reader supposes that a survey of the leading countries in isolation from one another, or rather the contemplation of their respective local chronicles, can have given him an intuition into the scheme of the world in its general arrangement and setting, I must hasten to expose his fallacy. To my mind, the persuasion that an acquaintance with local history will give a fair perspective of the whole phenomenon is as erroneous as the notion that the contemplation of the disjecta membra of a whole living, beautiful organism is equivalent to the direct observation of the organism itself in all the energy and beauty of life. I fancy that anyone who maintained such a position would speedily admit the ludicrous enormity of his error if the organism would be revealed to him by some magician who had reconstructed it at a stroke in its original perfection of form and grace or vitality. While the part may conceivably offer a hint of the whole, it cannot possibly yield an exact and certain knowledge of it. The pre-Christian historian is quoted at length. This pre-Christian historian is quoted at length because of the startling similarity between his assertions and those of contemporary transactionalists, who have defined the transactional approach as one designed to correct the fragmentation of experience on whatever level it may occur, and as the right to see together much that is talked about conventionally as if it were composed of irreconcilable separates. Written more than 2,000 years earlier, Polybius's words clearly carry the theme of the interdependence of all aspects of experience as follows. It is quite impossible to make a good start in anything without, in anticipation, mentally embracing the completion of the project, or realizing in what sphere and to what purpose and for what reason the action is projected. It is equally impossible adequately to summarize any given course of events without, in the process, referring to the starting point whence and how and why that point has led up to the actual transactions of that moment. In these statements, there may also be located the germ of what later was to be termed contextualism, a theory asserting that the behavior of all things is determined by the conditions under which it occurs, and that everything derives its meaning from the role and function it plays in the new structure. This contrasts sharply with the tradition attributed to Aristotle that declared that the behavior of material beings is determined by their nature. In effect, the history of transactionalism embraces the metaphysical spectrum, sample views of which are represented by the two traditions cited above. The former tradition or concept was raised to prominence by Galileo in the 17th century. His contribution and that of physical science in general will now be considered. Galileo. The tradition inherited by Galileo was a long and respected one. Attributable in great part to Aristotle, it dominated all aspects of scientific thought. For the purposes served by the present study, however, it will be sufficiently instructive and illustrative to consider the particular problem of motion. For centuries, it had been taught that all bodies in motion come naturally to rest due to their own inner tendency to fulfill, as it were, an inherent nature. This explanation of a phenomenon is a specific example of the assumption already stated in an earlier paragraph and prevalent at the time, that the behavior of all things is determined by their nature. The Aristotelian notion concerned itself with perfection. It prized circles over ellipses and asserted that straightforward motion is indeed determined by the nature of what is actually moving. It was against this notion that Galileo fought, and was led ultimately to question seriously the belief that things inherently possessed being to such a degree that they could and did continue eternally under their own power. Faced with motions assumed to be the result of impressed force, he strove to locate the how. Expressed differently, Galileo refused to seek the causes of the behavior of physical phenomena in the phenomena alone, and sought the causes in the conditions under which the phenomena occur. It is not necessary to detail the experiments performed by Galileo as he set about answering this revolutionary question, but it is necessary that sufficient explanation be presented to indicate the revolutionary nature of his work. Pre-Galilean or Aristotelian physics had been opposed to the claims of the early atomists, who held that in order to explain the functioning of organisms and simple physical phenomena, it was necessary to conceive of the limited divisibility of all matter. Aristotle, however, impressed with the wholeness exhibited by living things, held to a view which introduced into his examination of nature such concepts as perfection and purposefulness. These concepts must be considered preeminently as valuative. That is to say, nature must be perceived as a qualitative whole, throughout which is to be found a hierarchy of forms ranging from those of lower value to those of higher. This attempt to classify the elements of nature in terms of value led inevitably to a separation of phenomena. For Aristotle, the membership of an object in any given class defined the essential nature of the object and hence determined its behavior. Galileo's task was in effect to demonstrate what he believed to be the unity of the science of motion that existed above the earth and upon it, and thus refute the dichotomy asserted by Aristotle. His argument is succinctly stated in the Dialogues. Now, as to Simplicio's final remark, he says that it is folly to debate whether parts of the sun, moon, or any other celestial body, if separated from their whole, would naturally return to it, because, he says, the case is impossible, it being clear from Aristotle's proofs that celestial bodies are invariant, impenetrable, indivisible, etc. I answer that none of the conditions by which Aristotle distinguishes celestial from elemental bodies has any other foundation than what he deduces from the difference in natural motion between the former and the latter. In that case, if it is denied that circular motion is peculiar to celestial bodies, and affirmed to belong to all naturally movable bodies, then one must choose one of two necessary consequences. Either the attributes of generable, ingenerable, alterable, inalterable, divisible, indivisible, etc., suit equally and commonly all world bodies, as much the celestial as the elemental, or Aristotle has wrongly and erroneously deduced from circular motion those attributes which he has assigned to celestial bodies. The revolution that was wrought by Galileo embraced, in other words, the shift from the heterogeneous to the homogeneous, and branded as false the dichotomy between the earthly and the heavenly worlds. From the perspective of the present study, that aspect of the revolution which is most decisive concerns Galileo's classic investigations of the law of falling bodies, for it was these which gave the lie to the Aristotelian assertion that the vectors determining an object's movements are completely dependent upon the nature of the object itself. In effect, Aristotle stated that such vectors do not in any way depend upon the relation between the object and its environment, but actually belong to the object irrespective of its surroundings at a particular time. That Galileo stressed the whole situation rather than being content to emulate his mentors and predecessors, all of whom were apparently hypnotized by the essence of the object, is exemplified by his experiments with falling objects, or movements on an inclined plane. He was more concerned with the process of movement than with the body being moved, a fact that signifies a transition to concepts which can be defined only by reference to a certain sort of situation, namely the presence of a plane with a certain inclination. The idea of investigating free falling, which is too rapid for satisfactory observation, by resorting to the slower movement upon an inclined plane, presupposes that the dynamics of the event is no longer related to the isolated object as such, but is seen to be dependent upon the whole situation in which the event occurs. The traditional conception that all bodies in motion come naturally to rest because of their own intrinsic tendency to fulfill an inherent nature was brought into question by these experiments. Specifically, Galileo employed an inclined plane, which enabled him to observe and measure with greater facility than free-falling weights would allow. His first major achievement in this set of experiments was the discovery of the formula for the acceleration of falling bodies, arguing that free falling is a special case, that of falling at an incline of 90 degrees instead of at a lesser angle. His further manipulations of the environment resulted in the realization that acceleration decreases in proportion to the angle of inclination, and that further acceleration is the salient factor in the situation. It occurred to him to attempt the opposed case, in which a weight is projected upwards, whereupon he discovered that a negative acceleration resulted, decreasing as the angle of inclination diminishes from the right angle. Finally, Galileo was compelled to inquire what would occur when the plane became horizontal, that is, when the angle fell to 0, and the body is in motion. In accordance with the structure of the situation he had set up, if no positive or negative acceleration were present, constant movement had to be the consistent theoretical answer. This finding was revolutionary. It directly contradicted the Aristotelian tenet, already cited, that a moving body sooner or later comes to a standstill if the force responsible for the motion no longer acts. Galileo had experimentally shown that a body moving at constant velocity is not dependent upon the continued push of an actor or some equally ubiquitous but mysterious party, but will continue in motion regardless of the strength of the impressed force, provided it is not impeded by external obstacles. A summation of the significance of Galileo's findings, together with the manner in which interconnections were viewed by him in an entirely new structure, is offered by Wertheimer. Its clarity justifies its lengthy inclusion. Previously, rest and certain natural circular movements were fundamentally separated from, opposed to, the other movements. Now rest and constant rectilinear movement are seen together as structurally equivalent and separate from, opposed to positively or negatively accelerated movements. Rising and falling bodies are viewed together as cases of acceleration in the symmetrical division of the whole picture. Free falling and free rising are viewed as special cases of the whole group of movements in any straight direction. The end of a movement is no longer seen as the necessary outcome of the diminishing, disappearing effects of vis impressa, imposed force. It is now seen in a basically different way. The movement is stopped externally by friction. Friction is no longer just one of the several factors to be considered in movement. It now has a role opposite to that of inertia. While previously the assumption had been that rectilinear motion comes to an end with or without friction, due to the natural extinction of vis impressa, the new view looks at friction as the fundamental cause of the limitations of motion. Force appears essentially as something determining acceleration. Everything gets its new meaning by virtue of its role and function in the new structure. The historical antecedents of transaction include two other levels of the organization and presentation of inquiry, namely self-action and interaction. The former is typified by the force, or actor-agent presumed by Aristotelian physics to be operative. The latter, which derives from Galileo's achievements, was first incorporated by Newton in a manner to be discussed below. Transaction itself, when defined as that level of human behavior where systems of description and naming are employed to deal with aspects and phases of action, without final attribution to elements or other presumptively detachable or independent entities, essences, or realities, and without isolation of presumptively detachable relations from such detachable elements, is applicable to the Galilean view described above, inasmuch as what had been earlier conceived as a result of some outside element was now made a part of the whole situation. That is to say, Galileo was concerned with dynamical rather than formal terms. According to him, for example, nothing is known about the inner nature or essence of force. Only its quantitative effects in terms of motion can be identified. The further connections between self-action and interaction will be later described. What is of significance at the present stage of the study is that the former, as a physical doctrine, was completely overthrown by the experiments performed by Galileo. Relationships were established between the various factors in a particular situation, and new descriptions and explanations of physical phenomena on the basis of homogeneous space, time, mass, and motion. The pre-scientific, self-actual conception that bodies in motion arrive at a state of rest because of their intrinsic tendency to actualize a latent or implicit essence gives way, as will be seen, to a view that postulates dynamic interactions and connections with the objects of everyday experience. The potentiality which was once thought to unfold from within these objects is seen in post-Galilean doctrine to result from the consequences of such interaction. Galileo's work was unquestionably the practical manifestation of his lifelong polemic directed against what he considered to be slavish advocacy of the word of authority in the realm of empirical studies. It is fitting that Galileo himself be permitted to conclude the present section in typical fashion. I commend the reading and diligent study of Aristotle, and only blame the servilely giving oneself up a slave to him, so as blindly to subscribe to whatever he delivers, and receive it for an inviolable decree, without search of any further reason. This is an abuse that carries with it the other extreme disorder that people will no longer take pains to understand the validity of his demonstrations. And what is more shameful in public disputes than, while someone is treating of demonstrable conclusions, to have someone else come up with a passage of Aristotle, quite often irrelevant, and with that stop the mouth of his opponent? But if you will continue to study in this manner, I would have you lay aside the name of philosophers, and call yourselves either historians or doctors of memory, for it is not fit that those who never philosophize should usurp the honorable title of philosophers. Therefore, come with arguments and demonstrations of your own, or of Aristotle, but bring us no more texts and naked authorities, for our disputes are about the sensible world, and not a paper one. That's the end of the first part of chapter 2.